السلام عليكم.
يا أيها الناس يا أيها المسلمون O people of good conscience, O Muslims, I am the mu'adhin of this pulpit, and I demand that you hear my voice and hear my testimony. This is the pulpit of truth. This is the pulpit of light. The land of your prophets is burning. The stewards of the land of your prophets are bleeding. I am the mu'addin of this pulpit, and I demand that you hear my testimony, and I demand that you heed my call.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم، والحمد لله رب العالمين، ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، ونشهد أن محمد رسول الله. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى أصحابه المختارين، وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. سبحان الله، سبحان الواحد الأحد، سبحان المنتقم الجبار، سبحان العلي الوهاب، سبحان من رفع السماء ووضع الأرض للأنام. سبحانه. اللهم إنا نستنجد بك ونستجيرك ونستنصرك، فاللهم أعنا، اللهم انجدنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم يا علي يا عظيم، اللهم اصلح لنا ديننا الذي هو عصمة أمرنا، واصلح لنا دنيانا التي فيها معاشنا، واصلح لنا آخرتنا التي فيها معادنا، واجعل الحياة زيادة لنا من كل خير، واجعل الموت راحة لنا من كل شر يا رب العالمين. Well, quite obviously, there can be no other project, no other subject. There can be no other subject than living through a historical moment in which you witness a genocide unfold right before your eyes. A siege medieval-like assault on a people that have been repeatedly assaulted time and time and time again. An actual ethnic cleansing, a displacement of an entire population. But this time, in our so-called post-colonial age, in the age in which the same countries that are blessing and sponsoring the ethnic cleansing and the genocide feel superior to other cultures and superior to other races, purportedly because of the strides they made in promoting and embracing the ideology of human rights, humanism, humanitarianism, we all, whether we are aware of it or not, our intellects seamlessly absorbs the traces of history past. We are cumulatively the product of the generations that preceded us. And whether we are conscious of it or not, it is as if the history that has molded our very person and our very consciousness is encoded in our very cellular structure. Whether you are aware of it or not, if you are born a Muslim and if you come from the majority of Muslim countries, so if you are a Muslim from Africa, a Muslim from the Middle East, a Muslim from Asia, the sense of humiliation, helplessness, powerlessness, and absolute frustration that you feel is born out of the fact that throughout colonial history, throughout the modern history of Islam, we have witnessed, meaning our generations have witnessed, it has become coded in our very cellular structure, in the blood that flows through our vein. That same repeated dynamic, Western powers, which also happen to be the colonial powers, adopt a discourse, a triumphalist discourse, a discourse in which humanitarian ideals are cited as evidence, on the one hand, of the superiority of the Western ethical consciousness, and at the same time, and on the other hand, the inferiority of Muslim consciousness. Throughout a long history of colonialism, whether you are speaking about British colonialism, or French colonialism, or indeed, outside the Muslim world, Spanish colonialism, doesn't really matter. The colonial pattern and dynamic is the same. The colonial power assumes a discourse, a narrative, in which the colonized is consistently shamed for their lack of understanding of what we today call liberal values and what was throughout the colonial age called civilizational values. But at the same time, when the colonizer encounters an act of resistance by the colonized that deeply hurts and offends the colonizer unleashes a tirade of violence that has no relationship whatsoever to the humanitarian ideals that the colonizer had preached to the colonized throughout this dynamic. And the violence that is unleashed by the colonizer, by the white man, by Western powers, time and time and time again, is of genocidal proportions. You will hardly find a Muslim country that has not experienced this dynamic in relation to the West at some point or another in its history. We are the repositories of the generational memories, the repositories of history. And so deep within the Muslim soul, it feels this sense of tragic injustice feels incredibly familiar. It is as if our very psyches are saying, we've been here before, we've been here many times, we've been here repeatedly. The remarkable thing about racist discourse and racist dynamics, the remarkable thing about colonial racism and settler colonialism, indeed, is the narrative that is communicated in so many different ways, but it always says the same thing over and over and over. And this narrative is, I, the supreme power, the colonizer, I am a sophisticated, layered, and complicated entity. You are not within the boundaries of sanity and indeed rationality if you deal with me through any sweeping generalizations or indeed the vast majority of generalizations, because I am a complicated reality. I am layered. And the only way you can deal with me is by being fully cognizant of the ways that I am layered. You, on the other hand, you Muslim, you Arab, you African, you Palestinian, you are a rather flat reality. I deal with you by largely, for the most part, ignoring the ways that you are nuanced and layered. And I deal with you through dumb litmus tests that either categorizes you into a good guy or a bad guy. And beyond that, I will not allow you to detain me much or to engage my attention beyond that much. I ignore your history, including any nuanced claims as to your land, your resources, your right to self-determination. I largely ignore everything that makes you into a layered, complicated, cultured human being. I ignore your poetry, I ignore your music, I ignore your art, I ignore your emotions, I ignore your feelings, I ignore your hopes, I ignore your aspirations. You are really only relevant to me to the extent that you disrupt or not disrupt my life. And to the extent that you can help me categorize you into either a good guy or a bad guy. And in fact, what I'm going to expect from you is that you do not bother me with your memory. Because you, as a flattened human being, in my consciousness, if you have tragedies, if you have memories of disempowerment and dehumanization, I have no time and I have no patience. And indeed, I do not wish to make that a part of the way that I relate to you. But it doesn't go the other way. So, for instance, Palestinians, if you want to deal with Israelis, you must be very cognizant of the trauma of the Holocaust. You must, in fact, not only that, but if you are to deal with Israelis, you must be nuanced enough to even differentiate between Israelis that came from Iraq, Israelis that came from Yemen, Israelis that came from Abyssinia, Israelis that came from Russia, Israelis who are descendants of Holocaust survivors, you must be fully cognizant of my complex theology and complex psychology, rather, and my complex history. And it is unforgivable for you to make generalizations about me. Think, for instance, immediately after the attack in Gaza, the whole Western world made it a part of the equation, part of what they expect from the other is to be fully cognizant in the myriad of ways that the attack on Gaza invoked the memory of all the terrorist attacks that the West has endured, including 9/11. So if you want to understand my response, i.e. the West, to Gaza, you must understand my experience with 9/11, my fears after 9/11, my anxieties after 9/11. But on the other hand, when we deal with Palestinian consciousness, we expect the Palestinian to present the Palestinian self without even a memory of a massacre that took place 2018, the demonstrations of return, and the way that the peaceful demonstrators were shot dead or maimed or paralyzed. We talk to the Palestinian, we deal with the Palestinian on the assumption that that is irrelevant. It is even irrelevant that you remember how many times the Aqsa Mosque's sanctity has been violated. It is also irrelevant the fact that Israelis regularly shoot and kill Palestinians and have done so every single week since the beginning of 2023. And that there is never any type of investigation of oversight. You expect the Palestinian to have a blank memory, their memories of tragedy and suffering, their memories of trauma, their history, in other words, is entirely irrelevant. This is precisely why the minute the colonizer deals with the colonized, the first question the colonizer has is, do you condemn the attacks on me? Because that allows me to file you away. If that allows me to categorize you as either a good guy or a bad guy, and once I categorize you as such, it's not that if I categorize you as a good guy, there is an implicit promise that I will recognize your history or recognize your just claims or recognize your rights or do anything. No, all that does is that when I categorize you as a good guy, I simply allow you to exist. Nothing more. I simply do not seek to put you in prison or to lock you up in Guantanamo or have you disappear in a black site. or freeze your assets. If I categorize you as a good guy, pretty much you're like the compliant house slave. You don't make waves. You do what you're told. You serve. It is my economy, my well-being, my happiness that is always the issue. Your happiness matters to the extent that it is a part of my happiness. So, to the extent that you are able to join in my production of culture, you might be irrelevant. But for the most part, what I want from you as a good guy is not to interfere. But if you're a bad guy, because you failed the stereotypical litmus test, then necropolitics is what sets in. You are already dead. It's like Israeli politicians have said about Gazans, or they said it about Hamas, but part of the colonial dynamic is to always have this language that acts as a panhandle for generalizations about the population of the colonized. Nowadays, Hamas is basically a code word for every Palestinian who does not submit. In the same way that once upon a time, words like Muslim or expressions like Muslim fanatic was a code word for every Arab who's not willing to accept French colonialism or British colonialism. The idea of fanatic or militant was always a coded way to refer to those who still within them have some desire to resist. And the deep sense of hurt and humiliation and pain is because remarkably, intuitively, a Muslim knows all of this. In fact, for a Muslim to deny any of this takes a bit of additional effort and a significant amount of cognitive dissonance. We all know, we all are familiar with the taste, the bitter taste of when the colonizer is challenged or defied, and the colonizer declares, like for instance, when once upon a time British planes, in response to an Iraqi rebellion, it was the same Churchill, the hero of World War II, that ordered British planes in 1938 to gas Iraqi demonstrators and Iraqi rebels that were demanding Iraqi independence. They were gassed to the death. We all forget the democratic revolution in Syria and how viciously it was repressed, and the number of souls and lives that were destroyed to repress the democratic aspirations of the Syrian people. in the 1930s. The same thing with every attempt by the Palestinian people to object to the way that the British was giving away their lands and their country, to say, we have a right, and there was indeed a Palestinian United Nations delegation that repeatedly tried to remind the United Nations in the couple of years from 45 to 48 that Woodrow Wilson has just stated the Woodrow Wilson points on self-determination, and we, as a representative of Palestine, have a right to self-determination like all member states. And indeed, the very foundation of this new UN system is premised on the end of colonialism, ending colonialism. So how can it possibly be logical that before you end colonialism in Palestine, your parting gift is that you are going to put an end to historical Palestine as it has existed for centuries? A familiar history that is ingrained in the very molecular structure of all Muslims who have grown up as African, as Asian, as Arab, of course, as Palestinian. Now, part of this narrative I know so many people that say, wait, don't you know that Hamas attacked people who are just simply listening to music and dancing? Or don't you know that Hamas attacked civilians and children and killed and pillaged? How can you possibly not be outraged and not immediately condemn? And again, they don't understand that part of what has been encoded within us as a colonized people is the distrust of the colonial narrative. That time and over and over and over again, throughout the history of colonialism, not just in the Middle East and not just in Africa, but even colonialism in the United States, for instance, as the way that we colonized Native Americans, is the demonization of the colonized and the spreading of narratives of barbarism about the colonized that history teaches us again and again and again that the way the colonizer sees the colonized is presumptively as a barbarian, as a person devoid of morals and ethics, and that time and again, the colonizer tells narratives about the colonized that portray the colonized as absolutely inhumane, hardly human, as we heard the Israeli politician who referred to the Gazans and Palestinians, because I've heard this numerous times from numerous Israeli politicians, they're human animals. And that time and time again, when we go back and look at the claims made by the colonizer, we find that these claims are unfounded or grossly exaggerated. So obviously, without a shadow of a doubt, if indeed people who were enjoying themselves dancing were massacred, babies were killed, women were raped, I have no reservations about standing up and praying to God with all my heart to curse any Muslim who would commit such an act. Without a shadow of a doubt. Without a shadow of a doubt. To me, I set up, or I would put them against who I believe is a far more powerful judge than any other human, and that's God, God's self. But even more than that, the way that we resolve this, if we were not the colonized and the colonizer, is to say, okay, we have claims about atrocities. So what do civilized people do when they have claims about atrocities? They go to a civilized institution, like the International Criminal Court, for instance, and give the International Criminal Court full access to investigate and to verify. They don't believe politicians like Biden, who claim that he's seen evidence of babies beheaded. They don't believe a politician like Netanyahu, who every Israeli, before this happened, recognized is a liar. In fact, in Israeli media, is sometimes described as a pathological liar and is thoroughly corrupt. That is not enough. If we were not a colonizer and a colonized, the way we would do it is we would invite Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Human Rights First, the International Criminal Court, come investigate. And any member of either the Israeli military or indeed Hamas that has murdered a child, that has raped a woman or a man, for that matter, that has committed a war crime or a crime against humanity, would be considered a criminal, and we would support and fund a body that vigilantly prosecutes, seeks to arrest and prosecute and punish. But what is the problem with this? In 2007, the Palestinian Authority signed the Rome Statute that empowers the International Criminal Court to investigate and to indeed bring charges. Israel refused to sign the Rome Statute. Human Rights Watch repeatedly investigated atrocities by both Israelis and Hamas. And every time Human Rights Watch or Amnesty or Human Rights First came out with a report, Israel waved it away as anti-Semitic. Although I can tell you that many of the folks who work on these reports in Human Rights Watch are not just Jewish, but are loyal Zionists as well. Not only that, but since the Palestinian Authority signed the Rome Statute, the United States and Israel has made sure that the International Criminal Court not make one step forward in its investigation of alleged war crimes committed by Israel and by Hamas. So we go back to that paradigm time and time again. The colonizer says, "You're a barbarian." The accused barbarian says, "Not true. I am a layered human being. I am not out to just kill and maim. I have legitimate causes. I have legitimate rights." The colonizer says, "No, you are nothing but a barbarian. In our words, in our language today, a terrorist. No legitimate claims, no rights, no history, no literature, no art, no anything. You are nothing but a barbarian. And it's my word and nothing." Meaning, I must be believed because I am somehow just inherently more credible than you, the colonized, and than any outside party that might even arguably be impartial. The colonizer has always been, wants to be the claimant, the plaintiff, the petitioner, and the judge at the same time. So, look, the response of the United States, typical colonial response. It's not that we will make every effort for an impartial investigation in what happened, and we will make every effort, once the facts are established, to prosecute people and to enforce a law against individuals who are responsible. The response is we will give Israel blank check to inflict as much suffering and mayhem and destruction, because how dare the Palestinians say we have not given up? Repeatedly for years, as I interacted with various, typically they're actually American Zionists, not even Israelis, who tend to be far more militant and far more radical than Israelis themselves. I was repeatedly told the problem with Palestinians is that they don't realize they've been defeated. They've lost. They just should accept they've been defeated. And like the Germans in World War II and the Japanese in World War II, they should just accept terms of surrender. Every honest American Zionist knows exactly what I'm talking about. If you are honest, you know that you've heard this before in your synagogues, in your churches. You've heard this repeatedly on Israeli media. Palestinians should simply accept whatever terms Israel gives them because they've been defeated, just like Japan and just like Germany. Now, of course, that completely ignores that the Germans surrendered but still had a country, and the Japanese surrendered but still have a country. That part is conveniently ignored. So, when the Palestinians, in fact, see that we are trying, whether it was the Trump administration or the Biden administration, we conveniently ignore that we agreed against international law for Israel to declare Jerusalem occupied territory its capital. I remember when this was done and the extent to which the American diplomats were worried that the response would be something like what actually happened today. I remember when numerous State Department people told me personally that they are very worried that with moving of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, that Palestinians are going to lose their mind, quote, end quote. Nevertheless, we did it. Palestinians were told to sign the Oslo Accords. And look what happened to the person who signed the Oslo Accords. Arafat was told to lay down his weapons and trust the Israelis. And look what happened to Arafat. Look what happened to the Palestinian Authority, which basically was empowered to become a watchdog against its own people, but nothing more than that. A bunch of corrupt, inept politicians bribed in millions of dollars by the West. So in other words, the Palestinian we want, like every colonized person that the colonial power wanted, is a corrupt colonized, a bureaucrat who is ready to sell his mother and his very soul. That's the way we like our colonized people. Corrupt, unethical, without any sense of loyalty, fidelity, or principles, or cause. What did we do when we first invaded Afghanistan? Look it up. The first thing we did is look for corrupt allies. The first thing we did, we sent CIA agents with bags of dollars to find corrupt allies who are willing to accept money in return for effectively betraying their own people. If an American did the same thing, China, for instance, was invading the US, and China sends people with bags of dollars to buy American loyalty, I am absolutely sure that Americans would not think twice about punishing every person who accepts money from an occupying power as a traitor. But we did it to the Afghanis, as we did it to the Iraqis, as Israelis do it to Palestinians. If you're corrupt and you accept our bribe money, you're a good guy. Yes, you're a traitor to your people. Yes, you're a narcissist and a selfish SOB, but you're a good guy. Because you don't create problems for us. So it blows your mind. Why have the Palestinian people elected Hamas? Really? Because thanks to you, the only authority that claims to represent them, an equally dictatorial and undemocratic authority with a horrible human rights record, thanks to you and thanks to your money, has been thoroughly corrupted. Everyone who is in charge in the Palestinian Authority is either on Israeli payroll or Emirati payroll. You know that, and I know that. And so Palestinians find both dictators, both in the Palestinian Authority and in Hamas. But Palestinians have something far greater than Hamas or the Palestinian Authority to worry about. And you know what that far greater thing is? Sheer survival. We ignore that even David Cameron, the former Prime Minister of Britain, Carter, leave alone practically anyone who's anyone in the South African church, including Desmond Tutu and etc., have consistently referred to the regime in Israel as an apartheid regime, and have consistently referred to Gaza as the biggest open-air prison in the world. Even before all of this happened, unemployment rate in Gaza, 50%. Heroin addiction in Gaza is out of control because people have no prospects, no jobs, no hopes, no aspirations, no dreams. Even before this happened, 70% of the water in Gaza is not fit for human consumption. Even before this happens, we've made sure that the Egyptians turn their dealing with Gaza into the most corrupt, profit-making enterprise. If you're a Gazan and you need to leave Gaza through the Egyptian side to do an operation that would save your parent, you have to bribe Egyptian authorities thousands of dollars. So we conveniently ignore the fact that UNICEF has documented that Israel even calculates the amount of calories it allows into Gaza, that Israel keeps the food items that enter into Gaza at mere subsistence level. No health care, no job prospects, no life, simple subsistence. That Israel every single week kills and maims. On top of that, persistent humiliation as Muslims around the world are forced to watch on live TV repeated insults and transgressions and violations against the Aqsa Mosque. And again, the colonizer looks to colonized and says, don't you dare do anything that we would deem barbaric. The most you are allowed to do is just scream in frustration and agony. But even then, not in the spaces we don't want you to scream your agony in. So if Palestinians, as they watch the persistent violations against the Aqsa Mosque, attempt to protest in the West Bank or Gaza, the Israelis respond, you shall keep the peace in Judea and Samaria, which is another humiliation and another erasement of personality and history and character. It's not the West Bank, it's Judea and Samaria. The same West, colonizing West, that supposedly teaches the world the values of human rights, the liberal values, in France violently suppress people who want to demonstrate supporting the Palestinian cause. In Germany, ban pro-Palestinian demonstrations. In Britain, make it a crime to raise the Palestinian flag. We all feel the tinge of humiliation, the sense of painful familiarity. Even if we can't articulate it in words, our very spirits are saying, we've been here before. We've been here many times. We've been here as time and time and time again. Our will, our self-determination, our sovereignty, the right to decide anything about our future is stripped away. We've been here before when we are dumbed down, stereotyped. We are treated no better than sheep or a herd that is divided into types, productive for us and not productive for us, useful for us and not useful for us. We have been here before, where sophistication, nuance, retrospect, morality is only expected when dealing with the superior race, the race that dominates. But stereotype, simplicity, idiocy is the only thing that will be tolerated when dealing with the inferior race. We've all been here before. And this is precisely why the genocide taking place in Gaza is killing every decent Muslim around the world. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وسبحان الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه يا رب العالمين. You know, these events, the fact that, as I've already said, and I will say it again and again and again, that we see that same pattern. The party that controls all the power, has all the power, has a narrative, and the way it relates to this narrative is either you embrace my narrative and shape your positions on the basis of my narrative, or you're a terrorist, a criminal, subhuman, inhuman. And when we attempt to return the gaze and say, okay, well, how about my narrative? Is there any possibility, because my narrative clashes with a lot of what your narrative, so is there a possibility that we would find some dynamic, some process in which I don't simply surrender to your narrative as you don't simply surrender to my narrative? Like the International Criminal Court of Justice, or like NGOs like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty. The response is always no. If you don't embrace my narrative, then you're a barbarian, you're an anti-Semite, you're a terrorist, you're ISIS, you're whatever. This, to me, underscores two things. And I sincerely say this. If I was an Israeli, I cannot imagine a worse past to pursue than what is going on today. It is remarkable. This is an Israeli government that from day one was seen as corrupt and racist and supremacist. From day one, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have been literally aching to obliterate Palestinians. An Israeli government led by a politician that you would have to be quite disingenuous not to see as an opportunist, as a liar, as an unethical human being. Suddenly, overnight, that same government is trusted in its narrative. Whatever they say, we believe. That same government reminds me of the government that was responsible for Sabra and Shatila. And the truth about the massacre of Sabra and Shatila didn't come out till long after Sharon was no longer in power. This is a government that our government simply said, we will forget your racism, we will forget your fanaticism, we will forget your dishonesty, we will forget your corruption. And not just our government, but the entire world said, we will trust you simply because you're the colonizer. We will believe your narrative. We will pretend you're not racist, you're not supremacist, you're not corrupt. We will pretend. We will pretend that there's only the Hamas terrorists, these bad, bad guys, and you're angelic. This is why it hurts so deeply. It doesn't work that way. It shouldn't work that way. If when the colonized, every time they try to find some impartial source that speaks the truth, the colonizer simply looks at it and says, I don't recognize that source. I remember, and maybe some of you remember, the Goldstone report about Israel in Gaza. 100 pages of fact-finding by a prominent international law professor. And the reaction of Israel and its allies, although he's Jewish, but as usual, oh, just anti-Semitic nonsense. I remember Richard Falk. He's also Jewish, who was a special reporter for the UN, who documented the racist regime that rules over Palestinian lives. Again, Israeli and American response, Richard Falk, he's a self-hating Jew, an anti-Semite. We don't recognize the narrative. James Dugard, a very well-respected and prominent professor of international law, someone that I personally studied under at the University of Pennsylvania when he was visiting there. A brilliant man. Special reporter for the UN, documents the persistent acts of abuse, as well as on the other side, acts of terrorism. But because it wasn't a one-sided narrative in which the Palestinians are the bad people and the Israelis are the heroes, what was the response to James Dugard? Oh, he's an anti-Semite. Doesn't count. So we remain trapped. You know what this underscored for me? Muslims have to wake up to the reality that unfortunately the colonial ego has never been able to let go of its colonial supremacist premises and assumptions. The way that it sees the world is either you are subservient to me or you are my enemy. We see this very clearly. When we give Israel the green light to commit a genocide, we send a warship to basically tell other Muslims, don't you dare come to the aid of your brothers in Gaza and sisters in Gaza. If you dare come to their aid, as we will slaughter them. We are here to tell you we will pounce on you. And no one points to the immorality of this. While we meaning the West, are free to come to the aid of our brothers in Ukraine. We are free to come to the aid of our brothers in Israel. We are free to come to the aid of whomever we wish. If you attack one member of NATO, you've attacked all of NATO. It is inconceivable that anyone would commit an act of aggression against Britain without being fully cognizant of the fact that they have to contend not just with Britain, but with the US. While they get to act effectively as one soul, the logic, they force Muslims to accept is that we see you not as just Muslims. We see you as Shia and Sunni. We see you as Wahhabi versus non-Wahhabi. We see you as moderate versus fanatic. We see you as Egyptian versus Syrian. We see you as Saudi versus Yemeni. We see you as Iranian versus Saudi. We see you that way, so you will act that way. So, any Muslim who accepts and internalizes and perpetuates this way of seeing Muslims, in my book, from now on, until the day I leave this earth, is a traitor. Any Muslim who speaks to me about the Shia and Sunnah and the difference between Shia and Sunnah, you and I will meet one another as contenders and as litigants in the hereafter. I don't recognize you as anything but a traitor. Any Muslim who recognizes the treacherous Muslim regimes of today, look, a people, 2 million or over 2 million people denied electricity, medicine, food, water. And all of this wouldn't happen if it hadn't been for their Muslim brothers by the treacherous government in Egypt that is fully cooperative with Israel in its blockade of Gaza, and that plays the role of the subservient errand boy. The entire Egyptian military, every time you say anything about Egypt, oh, the US helps arm the Egyptian. The US has been spending billions of dollars on the Egyptian military since Camp David. To what effect? So that the Egyptian military will take a stand against the Israelis? Clearly not. So the Egyptian military will take a stand against Ethiopia, building its dam on the Nile? Clearly not. So the Egyptian military will prevent the splitting up of Sudan and the splintering of Sudan into several nations instead of one nation? Clearly not. So the Egyptian military will do what? Yes. Use all the weapons that the US supplies it with for one sole reason: oppress its own people. The Egyptian military, since Camp David, has used its arsenal only against Palestinians and against Egyptians. So anyone that defends a regime like Sisi's regime is neither my brother nor my sister. I will meet you as my opponent in the hereafter. Anyone that defends the treacherous and treasonous regime of the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, who without reserve adopted the narrative of the colonizer and dismissed the narrative of the colonized as largely irrelevant, who very much like the colonizer internalized that view that either you're a good Muslim, meaning subservient completely, or you're a bad Muslim, meaning you're not completely subservient. Anyone, yes, and including Hamza Yusuf and Ben Bayya and the entire people of Zaytuna, that defends positions adopted and raised by the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain is not my brother and not my sister. And I will meet you as my opponent in the hereafter. Anyone that defends a regime in Saudi Arabia that uses its unbelievable military arsenal to butcher civilians in Yemen by the thousands and thousands, and then sit on the sideline watching their Muslim brothers and sisters in Gaza being exterminated, starved, no food, no water, no electricity, no medicine. Anyone that does not clearly condemn a regime like the one in Saudi Arabia, you're not my brother, you're not my sister, and I will meet you as my opponent in the hereafter. I thank Israel for making things so clear. Either Muslims wake up and read the reality and see the extent to which Muslims are weak and subservient. And let me tell you the secret for Muslims' weakness and subservience. Why is it that Muslims absolutely do not matter? Because the West doesn't deal with more than 1 billion Muslims in the world. The West doesn't. The West deals with the rulers who claim to represent the more 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. In other words, there are no Saudis. There's only the leader of Saudi Arabia. There are no Egyptians. There's only the president of Egypt. There are no Tunisians. There's only the ruler of Tunisia. There are no Moroccans. There's only the king of Morocco. So in other words, wake up. It is not women showing their hair that have defeated us and brought us to our knees. It is not men wearing gold that have defeated us and brought us to our knees. It is not listening to music or women doing adhan or indeed women leading prayer that have brought us to our knees. What has brought us to our knees is authoritarianism, despotism, the fact that these rulers don't have to be held accountable by their own people for their treacherous decisions, for their immorality, for their betrayals. They don't. So any Muslim who implicitly or explicitly doesn't condemn the authoritarian and despotic rulers all over the Muslim world is not my brother and is not my sister. And you are my opponent in the hereafter. You see, I learned well from my colonizer. My colonizer tells me if something occurs that is unethical, something that I have to suffer as the colonizer that is unethical and immoral, I expect you to clearly condemn it. I expect you to display clear moral stances. Now, it's true, when something unethical happens to you, like for instance, Israelis killing Palestinian civilians, Israelis killing Palestinian children, Israelis killing unarmed protesters, I'm not too bothered by that. And I'm not bothered if you're not bothered by that. In fact, if you're not bothered by that, I like you. Well, I've learned that my colonizer is right about one thing. The unethical and immoral cannot be tolerated. And for Muslims in this day and age, when they can witness and observe minute by minute the extermination in a genocidal war, their Muslim brothers and sisters, and they still talk about the Mahdi, or they still talk about al-Masih al-Dajjal, or they still talk about music, or they still talk about women's voice, or they still talk about women's hijab, or they still talk about men wearing gold, then you are unethical and immoral. And in my chapter, I cancel you till the day of the hereafter. اللهم اعف عنا اللهم اغفر لنا اللهم ارحمنا اللهم اهدنا لأقرب من هذا رشدا يا علي عظيم واصلح حالنا اللهم رحماك بأهل غزة اللهم رحماك بأهل غزة اللهم رحماك بأهل غزة اللهم صبرهم اللهم شد من عضدهم اللهم أيدهم اللهم يا رب كن في عونهم وارحم ضعيفهم وارحم أطفالهم ونساءهم اللهم سدد أزرهم يا علي عظيم لا إله إلا أنت اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على محمد وأقم الصلاة